Hi, I'm Nick Thomas and welcome back to the Sword Studies series on the Academy of Historical Fencing. So today I'm going to be looking at what we would commonly call the British flank officer's sword or sabre. But I have to actually stop there and just say that there's actually a few other things that this sword could be, and that will become clear as this video goes on. But that's the terminology that's commonly used for this kind of sabre or sword. But you'll see here that I've got three other swords on the table, and the reason for that is that to talk about that flank officer's sabre, I need all of these three to tell the story of how we got to this point and why. So what we have here on the table is what we would call a flank officer's sabre. So this is a Napoleonic era British infantry officer's sabre for the flank officers, or at least that's what we're commonly calling them today. Then we have an 1803 regulation infantry officer's sabre. So on the first Sword Studies series, I showed an 1803 with ivory grip and all the blue and gilt on it. This is a different 1803, and there will be videos on all of these swords individually in the future. I then have the 1796 infantry officer's sword. So this is the most common infantry sword of the Napoleonic period for the British. And finally, I have a 1796 light cavalry sabre, likely for an officer, which is important to explain why the flank officer is, basically, or how it came about. So, the flank officer's sabre is the sword, really, that fundamentally shows how important fashion is within the army. And that's kind of an interesting one, because typically you don't think of military equipment, at least as far as combat goes, because ceremonial use is different. But as far as combat goes, you think of military equipment as being purely functional and not fashionable, generally speaking. And yet, in the 18th and the 19th century, fashion was fundamentally incredibly important to the actual battlefield troops. And there are all sorts of reasons for that I can't delve into on this video, because that's just too far on the fringe. But yeah, fashion was immensely important, and you're going to see an evidence of that with this sabre and how we got to it. So, in the late 18th century, British swords and a lot of other British equipment was becoming standardized and regulated with sealed patterns, and that means that you the Ordnance Department, or actually whoever's in charge of that particular piece of equipment, has an item with a wax seal on it that is the standardized item that manufacturers can go to mimic. It's a pattern. And that was happening with a lot of equipment at the time. But because it was early days for a lot of that stuff, there's a bit of crossover. So some items had sealed patterns and some didn't. And some of the items are therefore a bit vague. So in the late 18th century, spadroons had become the standard for British Army officers. And again, I will do a video on this, but you can see that it is a light cut and thrust sword, completely dead straight with this double shell guard. And this had become standard in 1796. And before it, there was the same blade, but with a variety of different hilts. And around about 1797, it was reported that some officers were seen using sabers of this form. And why would that be? Well, it's possible that there was a bit of a backlash to the spadroon, because ultimately there are some terrible examples of this sword around, and some of them are just not fit for service, really. And it's possible that they wanted a better fighting sword, so something more robust, more reliable, more able to deliver a powerful cut. That's possible. And yet we fundamentally know that a lot of officers were using sabers more for fashion than anything else. And that is evidenced by a lot of these very, very lightweight flank officers' sabers, because ultimately what happened here is Hussar fashion was just sweeping across Europe. The Hussar fashion used a well-curved sabre like this, known for its immense cutting power. So you can see from this sabre, you're talking about something that is really a heavy, heavy cutter, heavy chopper. And this is an officer's sabre, so it's slightly lighter than the standard troopers models. And even this, you can tell, is an absolute beast. But it became immensely popular, and Hussar fashion started influencing military attire throughout the army. So, for example, their jackets, their boots, some of their hats, it all started to get super, super popular because it was super fashionable. And what happened is that some army officers started carrying sabers of this form. So this is a 1796 light cavalry officer's saber, and some infantry officers started carrying similar swords, although they were usually slightly smaller. Not always, but they were usually just a slightly downscaled version of this. So a stirrup hilt with a well-curved heavy cutting blade, but again, they were sometimes a bit smaller. So that started happening, particularly among the elite officers of, say, the light infantry, the grenadiers. They started going for this. And again, it's possible that some of them, it is documented that some of them were doing it because they wanted a heavy fighting sword, a heavy cutting sword. But it's also pretty clear that they were doing it for fashion. And this did get accepted eventually down in 1799. The army just gave in and said, okay, flank officers are allowed to carry sabers. But they didn't stipulate what. There was no pattern, there was no description, there was no nothing. So in 1799, the officers of the flank companies were allowed to start carrying sabers, but they could decide basically the form themselves. And in 1803, we know we ended up with the slot hilt, beautiful slot hilt saber, which is regulation. So they did get a regulation sword of their own eventually. But in those years in between, they were just doing their own thing. And what that meant is that they tended to copy the light cavalry sabers, but end up with something rather smaller and more nimble. Because ultimately, a light cavalry saber, as amazing at cutting as it is, it's a brute to carry around, particularly on foot. It's long, it's heavy, the scabbard is heavy. It's not well suited to an infantry officer at all. It's a bit beastly. So yeah, they started getting sabers like this. And you'll notice it has a brass hilt. So at the time, infantry officers were carrying brass-hilted swords for the most part, whereas cavalry officers, for their fighting swords, were carrying steel. There's some crossover, like in the rifles, for example, they tended to carry steel-hilted swords. So there are some examples of infantry swords with that, and there are examples of cavalry swords with brass, particularly within the yeomanry, for example. But anyway, what you ended up with was a series of sabers that look like a light cavalry saber in form, roughly, but are lighter and smaller. So they're usually shorter in blade length and overall a fair bit lighter. Now, there's another factor which is important to consider here as well. In 1799, there was a campaign in Egypt, and following that campaign, some officers, for fashion purposes again, started to copy the swords of the Mamluks. So the swords in use with the Mamluks is a shamshir, which is a typically flat, unfulled blade, curved, and of this form. And it's what commonly would be called a scimitar in modern day, although scimitar is not a useful term at all. And so you end up with blades like this, which are unique in two ways. One, completely unfulled, which is not typical for British swords at this time at all. And the other thing is this wild curve. Now, the curious thing is actually most Mamluk swords don't curve quite so wildly. But for whatever reason, when the British took on board this Mamluk fashion, they also went even more curved. And that's probably because of stories of the wildly curved swords of North Africa. And they basically took the fashion too far. And actually what they ended up with, in my opinion, and actually several opinions noted at the time, was something that was a bit useless, is they just went too far with it. That's not to say you can't effectively fight with a sword this curved, but it is really ill-suited to the styles that the British were using at the time, which is a lunge-based style. It's not suited to that at all. A wildly curved, very short blade like this is really suited to a more walking-based footwork where you get in close and do really basic close-in slashes, as opposed to the using maximum reach on the lunge as was being taught within the British styles and generally North European styles at the time. But it was super fashionable. So you have two things going on here. Is one, the adoption of light cavalry sabers, in terms of their style for infantry officers, and two, this copying of Mamluk-style saber blades, although again, they didn't copy them exactly, they vaguely copied them and went a bit too crazy, and sometimes these are even described as half-moon or half-crescent blades by accounts of the time. Now, this, as I said, we would normally call a flank officer's saber today, and yet I said at the start of the video is that it could be many other things. So the reality is that this kind of saber was, yes, favoured by some infantry officers, particularly flank officers, but it was also used by light cavalry as their dress sword. So we know it's well documented that they just used lighter versions of their sabers as dress swords. I know you might think, well, why would they be using brass? Well, the heavy cavalry used steel-hilted fighting swords and yet brass-hilted dress or dismounted service swords. So that's possible there, as well as the fact that you will find steel-hilted examples of this sword, which I will show in other videos as well. And there's also the home forces, the yeomanry, the militia, the volunteers. All of these also loved the fashion of both the light cavalry saber hilt, the stirrup hilt, and the Mamluk style blade. Now, again, not all flank officer style sabers have Mamluk style blades. They can be found with fulled blades more like a light cavalry saber as well, and I will show examples of that in time. And part of the difficulty with these sabers is quite what to call them. So I've just said that it's commonly known as a flank officer saber today, and yet we know that other officers also carried sabers. Even line company officers were known to carry some sabers, so this could have been carried particularly in war by a line company officer. It shouldn't have been by regulation, but we know these things happened. And it could have been, yes, it could have been a dress sword for the cavalry, it could have been the home forces units, so there's a variety of different things it could be. It could even be a Royal Navy officer's saber as well. So yes, we commonly call them flank officer sabers, but the reality is these short sabers, whether they're Mamluk style or not, these small versions of the 1796 light cavalry saber, were actually used by quite a few different people, certainly commonly associated with flank officers, but a bit more widely used than that. So as you can see, this saber does follow the classic 1796, what we would call P-shaped stirrup hilt guard. It has the same langets as the 1796. It has the same hole for a sword knot to pass through, although the pommel on this one is slightly beaked, and actually the officer's light cavalry saber that I was just showing is also beaked, which was, again, a fashion item of the day. Now, beaked pommels might have initially been intended to serve a particular function with their grip, and that is that some saber manuals throughout history, not just British, have shown more like a pistol grip section like this, where you're using this large beak section and the space within the P to grip it like this. And curiously, that might possibly be the reason for this flared out section of the 1796 guard, which is still unexplained. People have theories, and that's one of them. And these beaked pommels are likely part of that as well. But ultimately, it was a very fashionable thing to do. So the chances are that a great number of officers weren't even gripping them like that. They were just buying them because they looked cool and they were fashionable, and they just gripped them like a hammer, as is described in some manuals for the period of this kind of saber. So they could use them thumbs up in this pistol position, or they could use them in a handshake or hammer grip type. But yeah, it's very much the 1796 light cavalry style. You'll see that it's got a leather grip. It has copper or brass wire. So all officer swords of this period should have wire grip. Again, doesn't mean they necessarily all do, but they should do. And that's it on the hilt. So you can see on the peen there, it's all nice and original. It still has some of its leather washer. So typically, most swords of this period have a leather washer between the shoulder of the blade and the guard, so that when everything clamps down from the peen, everything goes nice and tight. So you'll notice with this saber, it's one of those examples where the curve is actually so wild on it that I can't actually sit the saber flat on the scale. So I have to kind of balance it somehow carefully so that, there we go. So they'll actually sit on the scale. So this is 688 grams. Get out of the way. Wildly curved sabers can be a real pain at times to get some measurements on. Anyway, so 688 grams, and that means that this is a very light saber. And you will notice that 688 grams, that's in spadroon territory. So spadroons tend to weigh somewhere between about 650 to 750 for a double shell spadroon, like I showed at the start of the video. And this at 688 means it's actually within or towards the lighter end of the range of a spadroon of the time. Now you could say that the spadroon has shells which add a bit of weight to the hilt, but overall, in hand, I can tell you that this saber is not significantly more robust or particularly hard-hitting compared to a spadroon. And this is kind of my point, is that some officers might have started to carry heavy-duty sabers because they wanted something with some major cutting power. But the reality is that a great many of them actually just wanted something super fashionable because fashion was really important to them. Now, there's a few other possibilities as to why they adopted short and well-curved sabers, is that they are actually easier to wear. So its short blade means that it doesn't get in the way so much, and its curvature means that it curves around the body and away from the ground. So if you're scrambling over terrain and you're dropping down to one knee, for example, anybody that's worn these kind of swords versus a spadroon will know that fundamentally this is easier to live with when it's on your side than a spadroon is. So there's a possibility that it is a little bit more to do with the wearing of the sword as well. Although personally, I think it's fundamentally just about fashion. So 688 grams. Let's now take a look at the blade length. So with a curved saber, with any saber, we measure the blade length in a straight line from the tip to the shoulder at the back. So this is a 70 centimeter blade. That's 27.5 inches. And you're probably thinking that is really short, and you would be correct. So that is, noticeably shorter than the cutlass that I showed in the previous video. And the reality is that a lot of sabers at this time were very, very short. And to be honest, even the cavalry sabers of this era weren't always that long compared to what came afterwards in the 19th century, later in the 19th century. And actually, it's not even unique. It's not just that these sabers were unusually short. If you go back to the mid 18th century, or you go to the, say, American Revolution period, you'll find that officers at that time were commonly carrying what we would call a hanger, which is usually a lightly curved short blade, roughly of this size. Now, we tend to call this one a saber because, although it's what we would say is hanger proportions, it has a saber-styled hilt. Although it would be very much correct to call this a hanger in terms of its proportions. And the reality is that, yes, a lot of British infantry sabres of the Napoleonic period were surprisingly short, and they get shorter than this. So 70 centimetres is shortish, but they actually drop down to about 64, something like that, 65 centimetres. They can be really, really small. Now, let's have a look at the curvature. I already know this one because I've shown it very many times, but I will measure it again anyway. So yes, 10 centimetres or 4 inches of curvature. And when I talk about curvature on videos, when I get sabres that are 10 centimetres of curvature, I call that extreme. And it's kind of funny because a lot of people say, oh, that's standard for the Polish and blah, blah, blah. No, it wasn't. If you look at the specifications of Polish sabres, for example, most Polish sabres have a curvature between 5 and 6 centimetres, and they can sometimes be more like 4. 10 centimetres is an immense amount of curvature. It is really, really wild. By comparison, most cavalry sabres of this period have a curve between about 4.5 to 5.5 centimetres. So 10 centimetres curvature is absolutely outrageous. Now let's take a look at its balance, which again is a pain because it will not sit flat in the hand because it just has so much curve. And then of course it wants to slide in my fingers because it's not sitting flat. Okay, so the balance is 12 centimetres or 4 3/4 inches. That is fairly typical for a lot of infantry sabres and also not so far off some spadroons. So this sword is very short, the balance is fairly close to the hand, and it's overall very light. And so, as you would imagine, it is incredibly nimble, incredibly agile, really fast. And personally, I've done some test cutting with these Mamluk style Shamshir blades, and I have found that they cut just outrageously well. And I would say that's two things really. Is one, they tend to be quite stiff, which a stiff blade is very good for cutting. And the other factor is the edge geometry, is that when you fuller a blade, you have a more extreme angle that goes down towards the edge, whereas if you have a completely flat blade, the geometry down to the edge is really, really small, and so you end up with a very, very fine edge. Now this one is unsharpened, or we would say it's not been service sharpened, because again, typically swords were not sharpened, or military swords were not sharpened at this time until they went to war or to anywhere dangerous. So this one is completely blunt. But yes, from my cutting tests, I have found they do cut remarkably well. But let's not forget that this is also a very light sword. So it's under 700 grams. There's not a lot of mass in the tip. It would cut reasonably well, but it's also a very small weapon. Personally, you might think now I don't like this at all. I think they're kind of interesting, they're curious. Would I want to take this to war? Not ideally. To be honest, I find these little flank officers' swords, because flank officers' sabers, even if that's what it is, they vary immensely. They can be really quite small and a bit pathetic. Now this isn't quite that. It's not a pathetic weight by any means, but it is on the lower end, particularly for its considering it's not so short. I mean, 70 centimeters is short, but it's not crazily short. Yeah, I wouldn't want to take this to war. I would want something with a bit more reach, a bit less curve, and just a little bit more mass, personally. Especially because of this beaked pommel, it's actually got a fair bit of mass in the hilt, considering its weight. So let's have a look at some more stats. Let's get the calipers. So the blade at its widest point is 3.85 centimeters. So that's reasonably wide. There's not a lot of profile taper. So in the middle of the blade, it's still 3.4 centimeters. So as you can tell, it just does not have much until it gets to the last sort of, let's say, 20, 30 centimeters, maybe last 20 centimeters. So here it gets down to 3.2 centimeters, and then it tapers off from there. And if we look at the distal taper, you'll actually notice this one has quite a noticeable complex distal taper and a kick here. So it has quite a strong shoulder, 7.4 or 7.5 millimeters. So that's medium weight for its time. Only notice it's got quite a noticeable kick there, where it has a strong shoulder and then tapers in very, very quickly, a little sort of bottleneck section here. And then after that, it tapers pretty quickly. So it's already it's about 4.8 just immediately after that shoulder. If we go down to the midpoint of the blade, it gets down to 3.5. In the last 5 centimeters, it drops down to 1.5. And at the tip, it is 0.4 millimeters. So as you can see, it tapers quickly, and there's not a lot of mass in this blade at all. So there you have your close-up measurements, and at this point I'd like to show it alongside the Officer's 7096 light cavalry. Notice I'm showing an officer's example here because people commonly compare officers' infantry sabers to cavalry troopers' sabers, and it's not really necessarily a fair comparison. They should be compared to the officers' equivalents. And so here we have a really nice beaked pommeled, gill warranted light cavalry officer's saber. And if you look at the size comparison, you will notice that it is actually pretty damn small. By comparison, is that if you look at it in photos, you'd think it's roughly the same kind of hilt. And although in terms of shape, yes, it is, but in size, mass and strength, thickness of the metal, it is actually really quite small. And the same goes for the blade. So again, I will make a video on this this gill light cavalry saber, which is about 850 grams. So you can see you don't need to add a lot of mass to actually create a really solid fighting sword. Is that this little Shamshir one is under 700, and I find a little bit too flimsy. And yet this cavalry light cavalry officer's sword at 850 is actually quite a beast. So you don't need much grammage, essentially, to create a good fighting sword, if you like. So yes, my opinion on this particular flank officer's saber is that it's just a bit too small. I mean, it's not got much grip room unless you grip it with the pistol grip. It's quite light. There's not a lot of mass in the tip. It's fairly stiff, which these Shamshir blades do tend to be, although it is noted that also tended to be these Shamshir blades also tended to be a bit brittle as well, so there are quite a few examples of them snapping. And let's give you a few measurements on the hilt. So from the quillen section to, let's say, the inside grip, you've got 9 centimeters of grip space. inside the knuckle bow, which is not very much at all. It said it is quite cramped. Space here, you've got 3.5 centimeters at the narrowest point and 6 centimeters at the widest. So that's not too bad, but that's pretty close. Main thing is the length of this hilt. It's pretty short. The quillen block is 11.5 centimeters. That's reasonably respectable. Some of them are a fair bit shorter on the quillen section here that sticks out. And I suppose I could give you the depth of the guard, although it's pretty small. It's 2.5 centimeters wide at the langets. So there you have the flank officer saber. Now again, this is a non-pattern, non-regulation sword. So they come in a lot of different forms. You can get steel, you can get brass, and you can get various different curvatures and weights of the blade and the hilt. But overall, the common features is they usually are a fair bit smaller than the light cavalry saber, and usually a fair bit lighter. So what else can I say about this? Well, I also have the scabbard for this saber. You'll notice that there's one thing missing for most sabers, and that is you typically think of a saber as carried with a 2-ring suspension system like this. There were other means, of course, of carrying sabers, but commonly in this period, that's the one that's most commonly thought of. So you have a belt with 2 straps that drop down onto your rings. But this flank officer's saber, if that's indeed what it is, doesn't have that at all. All it has is this, which is what we will call a frog stud. And that means that this saber was designed to be carried in a belt of some kind using that frog stud. So here we have a reproduction. This is actually a naval sword belt or cross belt, but it's the same type that will be used to carry that exact kind of saber. So you have this slit here that you'll drop the scabbard down and through, and a hole that the frog stud will push into, and that means the saber is just going to be carried just through that one simple suspension system on the belt. In actual fact, some of these scabbards have both the 2 rings and the frog stud on them, so that obviously, you know, you buy your sword from a shop, you don't necessarily, the shopkeeper doesn't necessarily know, or the sword maker, who it's going to be used by or why, because different regiments use different sword belts and things like that. So you will sometimes see, yes, 2 rings and a stud, so that you've got the options there. And as you look at the portraits of these kind of sabers being carried, you'll also notice another item of fashion that was a little bit silly at the time, is there was a fashion trend for wearing your saber as low as you possibly could. And so these extremely long belts were used to carry the saber, so that it was actually touching the floor, and excessively so, dragging along the floor. And actually the dragging of the scabbards was actually a thing. But yes, that is another element of outrageous fashion of the time. So to finalise, the flank officer's saber, which, if that's what it is, we commonly call this kind of saber that today for convenience sake. But what it actually is a small officer's saber that could actually be used by a variety of different individuals in the last sort of few years of the 18th century and the first years of the 19th. And they didn't just go away. So in 1803, there was the slot hilt regulation flank officer's saber that was introduced, but these kind of small stirrup hilted officer's sabers didn't just go away. In actual fact, they lasted on, and some regiments even had their own regimental versions of this kind of sword. So they didn't just disappear overnight, and in fact, these went on through the Napoleonic period until realistically replaced in 1822 by the new regulation infantry sabers. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed the video. These flank officer sabers are pretty fascinating. Some of them I think are really good fighting swords. Some of them I think are just slightly silly fashion pieces. I think this one is on the side, most definitely, of a slightly silly fashion piece, because being this short and especially this wildly curved and not having that much mass in the tip, I don't think it's at all suited to the job it's intended for. And it's especially not suited to the methods that the British were using at that time as far as swordsmanship goes. Nonetheless, they're really beautiful swords that look awesome. So I do hope you enjoyed the video, and I will bring you many more soon. Thanks for watching, and please do subscribe if you haven't already.